But to make any sense of this, I've got to at least give you a little background, because you referred to priesthood old believers, priestless old believers. So when the Patriarch Nikon introduces the reforms of the ritual into the Russian Orthodox Church in approximately 1653, I guess I would say it begins with people who just oppose those reforms and what he's doing, especially because he did them on his own basis, and they felt they were ill-advised, and they were certainly earth-shattering if you're talking about ritual. To be taught all your life that particularly the meaning of the two-fingered sign of the cross, and then to go to the three-fingered sign of the cross, it led to a huge division in the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the Patriarch Nikon was able to, in one way or another, convince all the other bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's nothing like now where there are hundreds of them. I don't know exactly what the number was, I think 12, 15 or something. But in one way or another, he convinced the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church to follow him and to abide by the reforms he indicated. There was at least one bishop, Paul of Kolomna, who would not go along with those reforms. Patriarch Nikon had him imprisoned. He died in prison and really became a great hero for the old ritualists. So his main opponent was a man named Avvakum. Avvakum was the archpriest of the Kazan Cathedral in Moscow. It became like the story kind of Patriarch Nikon with the reforms and Archpriest Avvakum who opposed the reforms. So since the Orthodox Church is a hierarchical church, once all of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church accept the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon, even though over a period of time, and not a very long period of time, millions of Russian Orthodox oppose those reforms, they find themselves in a position going, what do we do now? Well, don't worry about it, because clearly this is going to be the end of the world. It was a very apocalyptic time through all of Europe, not only through Russia. So in the meantime, let's just really isolate ourselves, in many instances kind of go into communal places where men and women have no sexual relations and intimacy any longer, and we pray for the end of the world, and we simply wait for that to happen. When it doesn't happen by the end of the 17th century, the question becomes, what do we do? So a significant part of the old ritualists, they're really old ritualists, the staroobryatsi. Obryat in Russian means the ritual. So staroobryatsi means the old ritualists. They will pick up what I call the misnomer over a period of time, being known as staroveri by most people in Russian literature, meaning literally old believers, but in reality there's no difference in the belief of the old believers of the Russian Orthodox Church and all the other Orthodox Christians in the world. So, at least, let's say half and half, there are those who go, there's simply no priesthood left on the face of the earth. There's no hierarchy left. We're certainly not going to look to the Latins for a hierarchy. We believe they went into schism or heresy way back in the 11th century. And since the Greeks and the other Orthodox are the culprits, they're the ones who really caused Patriarch Nikon to introduce these reforms, we're not going to look to them, because if we don't think Patriarch Nikon's reforms are orthodox, we certainly don't think the people who led him into this are orthodox. So there's nothing we can do. Let's do this. The last ordained priest who was ordained before these reforms, before he dies, he'll give a blessing to some leader in the parish, and that leader in the parish will literally become the guide of the parish. He will be known as a nastavnik, N-A-S-T-I-V-N-I-K. The nastavnik will lead the prayers. In many places in the Russian Orthodox Church, because of the distance, it was not unusual for people to go for years with having reader services without a priest.
Hey, hit that like button!
And the reader services of the Russian Orthodox Church are really not that different than the prayer services you would have with a priest, particularly Vespers, Matins, Compline, midnight service, hours. There's hardly any difference. Instead of saying, for thine is the kingdom, after the Our Father, you'd say, Lord Jesus. Anyway, you could do these services pretty well. In an emergency, anybody can baptize, so the nastavnik can baptize. In an emergency, anybody can hear a confession. He can at least hear it, so a nastavnik can hear it. So over a period of time, what happens is it becomes the norm for at least half of the old believers to go, this is all we can do. It's probably God understands. We're probably not worthy of the Eucharist any longer. And so the priestless old believers become very much not content, but realizing, okay, this is the way it is. This is the way it's been for hundreds of years. And after a while, don't even have any sense that something's missing. Now, there's another significant part of the old believers, however, who go, we can't live without the full sacramental life of the church. What are we going to do? So in the beginning, what they do is they convince many of the priests of the dominant government church, that is the church under the Patriarch and the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, the post-Nikonian church, where old believers like to call them Nikonians, to, you really know the old rites better than the new rite, and there's things being done in the new rite that probably you don't agree with. Why don't you just come over and be a priest for us? So they're able to find priests who will literally flee from the dominant church and become priests for the old believers. So you have a significant part, about half of the old believers, being priested old believers versus the priestless old believers. And around the beginning of the 19th century, the old believers are becoming very popular because much of what's happened in Russia in the 18th century, I taught Russian culture for many years in a university here. The westernization of Russian culture has been so vast that many of the Russians are really becoming disgusted with, let's say, the westernization and the control of the state over the church. So the old believers are really becoming more and more popular in Russia. The Tsar Nicholas I orders these priests who are going over to the old believers to stop, or he's going to have them suspended. When that happens, the old believers try to find some way they can reestablish a hierarchy, and they find a bishop in Turkey who had had his diocese taken away from him by the Ottoman Turks. They convince this Ambrose to become a bishop for them, and they take him to an area that's called Belokrinitsa, which then was in Austria, now is in Romania, and they, in a sense, like clean him up, confess him, have him then become a bishop for the Old Rite. When Tsar Nicholas I finds out about this, Tsar Nicholas I indicates to Franz Joseph, the Emperor of the Austria, if you don't stop this, we're going to break off relations with you. And so Franz Joseph basically tells the Belokrinitsa hierarchy, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, I'm going to stop this. And so Ambrose, the bishop of the Belokrinitsa, immediately starts consecrating other bishops on his own, which is uncanonical and is certainly an irregularity. So you have priested old believers who have a questionable canonicity, but recognize no one else in the world as being Orthodox except themselves. You have priestless old believers, still several million, nothing like before the Russian Revolution, but still several million, particularly located in northern Russia and the Baltic countries where they fled persecutions against the old believers. Again, there are several million people in who are old priestless old believers. I know that's a lot of stuff. My parish is a parish of priestless old believers. Our people primarily came from Western Russia, from the Pskov area of Russia, being persecuted in many ways. I mean, some of those persecutions literally were putting to death. Other ones were persecutions. You couldn't build a church, you couldn't publish, you couldn't ring bells, you could have a tax on beards and so forth. So the parish that we came from, our people emigrated to an area which is now northeastern Poland. It's an area in northeastern Poland known as Suwalki, Suwalki. Then it was, in a sense, under the Russian Empire, kind of an autonomous area where the Polish authorities had authority, but they were still kind of answerable to Russian authorities. So my parishioners were priestless old believers who went to Suwalki in the late 19th century, for whatever the reasons were. I like to think in the beginning it was romantic reasons that they were being persecuted or whatever the case is. Now, after all these years, I'm more akin to the idea that, like most Eastern European people particularly, the concept was, America's lined, the streets of America are lined with gold. Let's go to America. We'll have a much better life. And so our parishioners, priestless old believers, began immigrating to America, particularly either came to an area south of Pittsburgh, south of Washington, Pennsylvania, where a lot of them became coal miners, and the coal mines needed them, didn't care if they spoke English, or they located here in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is on the shore of Lake Erie, where there were pulp docks and ore docks and coal docks, and they could find work, especially Irish business owners really were looking for employees. So this parish was particularly founded by those people. We continued to be priestless old believers throughout most of the 20th century. In the late third quarter of the 20th century, we had some problems in our parish. Our longtime nastavnik, mentor, minister, however you want to call him, although by this time they basically thought him as a priest, retired. We had some problems afterward. My parishioners begged me to take this position because I'd been involved since I was a boy, and I went to a summer seminary. I became the nastavnik of the parish in 1976, But when I found out that the anathemas against the old believers had been lifted by the Moscow Patriarchate in 1971 and by the church abroad, the church outside of Russia, the Zerobezhnaya Tzedkov in 1974, I began to look at this posture like, well, since the anathemas are gone and they recognize the old rite as being orthodox and saving, is it possible we could follow that path? I won't get into the whole long story with that, but I went through a long process with my parish, educating them. And in July of 1983, after a long study of this issue and a vote of our parishioners, around 75 to 80% of our parishioners agreed that they would accept this idea of us uniting ourselves with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is run by the New Rite bishops, but with the guarantee that we would be always able to use the old rite, and we would never be forced with the New Rite. So we then became the only parish in the church outside of Russia using the old rite. Finally, what happened in the last several years was there was a Protestant group, kind of a sectarian Protestant group, that became aware of Orthodoxy. They became aware of us. The leader of that group decided he really wanted to be Orthodox and really wanted to be under the old rite, so he was ordained a priest. He's in southwestern Missouri. So there's an Old Rite parish then again united to the church outside of Russia. And then just a year ago, a couple of priesthood old believer priests up in Oregon and Alaska, where there are thousands of old believers, two of them came to the conclusion that they no longer wanted to be part of the Belokrinitsa hierarchy, that is the hierarchy of priesthood old believers who recognize no other Orthodox in the world, and they also joined themselves to the church outside of Russia in this past January when they came to Erie actually and were chrismated and reordained to the orders by our Bishop John, who is one of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. His actual title is the Bishop of Caracas in South America, but he's also the protector of the old rite because he loves the old rite and really prefers the old rite. So there are now 4 parishes of old ritualists or old believers who are part of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia reunited itself with the Moscow Patriarchate in 2007, and so that makes us part of the larger Russian Orthodox Church in general. So sorry for that long thing, but in order to talk about anything else, you at least have to have some idea what does this mean.
No, that's great. That actually answered a fair number of questions. Is the majority of the old believers that exist today, are the majority of them priesthead or priestless?
I'd say half and half. And I would tell you, again, it's not I try to liken this to people to at least have some understanding. If you have understanding at all of what happened in Vatican II with the Roman Catholic Church, there's a similarity there. If you're an American and go, I don't get this, well, if you know anything about Vatican II and the reforms, you had significant portions, a significant minority of Roman Catholics who to this day do not like the reforms made in the Roman Catholic Church, and so, they go to Latin masses and so forth. That's kind of what happened in the Russian Orthodox Church. It's not that the old believers, old ritualists ever found themselves, totally changing. It was just, we don't want those reforms. Before the revolution, there's very little doubt, and almost all scholars, that there were probably somewhere around 20 to 30 million old believers in Russia. So the numbers were not some insignificant, infinitesimal minority. Probably if the old believers were persecuted, maybe even more than any other, the Orthodox, because they were so staunchly anti-communist and staunchly against the government during the Soviet period. So I'm going to say that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 1 to 2 million old believers left throughout the world. Again, primarily you'll find them in the in the northern part of Russia, particularly around the Moscow, St. Petersburg area, or mostly now I would say probably the largest centers of priestess old believers are in the Baltic countries, particularly in Lithuania and Latvia. The priesthood old believers are primarily more located in the Ural areas of Russia, although I shouldn't say that. They're probably all through Russia. So if there are 1 to 2 million old believers left in the world, I would say it's about half and half. There are old believer parishes now, again, significant communities up in Oregon and Alaska. I've been told, I haven't been up to Oregon a number of years, but I'm told there's probably maybe 5 to 10,000 of them up in the Oregon area, not anywhere near that in Alaska. And we were one of 4 parishes were called pomorce, priestless, or believers. The other parishes that did not adopt English as we did in the early 1980s and priesthood have, for all intents and purposes, died out. So there's probably 100, 150 in our parish here. And then again several thousand in either Oregon or up in Alaska, but again probably at least a good million. There's a good number in Australia, good number in some in the other parts of Europe and so forth, but primarily I would say Australia, Northwest North America, and then through Russia and particularly in the Baltic countries.
And you mentioned these 4 parishes that converted. In a way, or they rejoined the Russian Church,
rejoined.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
How many of all of the old ritualists have done that versus how many have not done that? Like, has that been a mass move?
Very few, but
in Russia
I think
itself?
Yeah, very few, but I think it's a growing number. What happened was in the 1800s, the Empress Catherine really offered this in the first time. She offered and said, look, why don't you old believers rejoin the church? We'll allow you to use the old rite of the Russian Orthodox Church. But the old believers understood this was actually a kind of a subterfuge. It was, we'll allow you to do this, but eventually you'll wise up and follow what everybody else does, and you're going to be really limited, and we're not lifting the anathemas and the curses against the old rite. So it never took on tremendously, but I'm told that probably before the revolution there were as many as 600 parishes in Russia that actually followed it. They became known as Yedinovertsia in Russian, which translates kind of loosely as one faith. There was a significant amount. Again, they were highly persecuted during the Soviet period, so I'm told there's only 30 or 40 parishes like that in Russia. I would not have joined my church to the church outside of Russia under those circumstances. I only did it when the anathemas were lifted by the Moscow Patriarch at the urging of the famous writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn.